Record and then whenever is good.
Okay, continue. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Nalani, and today Mari Grace and I are presenting about the lived experiences of survivors of sexual violence during war. Our research was specifically inspired by our conversations with the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten. We want to preface that the topics that we will be talking about today are difficult because they pertain to violence and sexual assault. While we don't show any graphic images, we just want to note this, so for your consideration. But with that, we will start. So before we delve into the topic, these are the main objectives that we hope you take away today. First, we hope that you're able to describe and assess the common use of sexual violence as an abusive tool of war, identify major persisting effects of sexual violence, and demonstrate the need and ability to reevaluate the initiatives set forth by national and international agencies to address sexual trauma. And here, to understand this, we need to understand that sexual violence is unfortunately too often seen as an inevitable consequence of war. While we aim to change this thought process, it is necessary to acknowledge that sexual violence does not discriminate. It affects people of all genders, ages, ethnicities, and the list goes on. The level of sexual violence differs significantly based on the country, the conflict, and the groups that are specifically involved. However, across the board, as we will show you today, there is a lack of accountability. Underreporting really paralyzes efforts to effectively bring justice and honor the human rights of survivors and those who have perished. So with that, we will get into the scope and evidence of our research. This is the approach we will take, starting with the war in the Pacific, and then we'll make our way chronologically to the Sri Lankan Civil War.
So jumping right in, during the War of the Pacific, the main use of sexual violence was through comfort women. The term comfort women refers to about 200,000 women forced into sexual slavery during the Asian and Pacific War, which took place during 1937 to 1945. The comfort women system was established to provide comfort to Japanese soldiers and to decrease the spread of STDs. Moving on from the War in the Pacific, we go to the Bosnian Genocide, which occurred in April of 1992, when Serbians set out to ethnically cleanse Bosnian territory. During this time, sexual violence was used to tarnish enemy bloodlines through rape and the resultant pregnancies of outgroup women and emasculating outgroup men through homosexualization. It is approximated that 12,000 women and 3,000 men were raped during the Bosnian Genocide. During the Rwandan genocide between the Hutus and Tutsis, 350,000 women and girls were systematically raped, tortured, or had forced pregnancies during the genocide, including both Hutu and Tutsi women. In regards to the Rwandan genocide, children born of genocidal rape face severe stigmatization and are marked with both marks of illegitimacy and association with the enemy. It's shown that they face many psychological difficulties, such as struggle with their identity, with their relationship with their mother, and a desire to learn of their biological inheritance. It's important that the Rwandan government set forth programs and policies to formally address the 2 to 10,000 children born in refugee or IDP camps as a consequence of rape.
And now we'll talk about the Sri Lankan Civil War. So brief background, this war was an ethnic struggle that gave rise to Tamil militant groups that were in conflict with the Sri Lankan government. But something that is important to highlight here is that in surveys after the Civil War, 29% of male respondents reported experience with sexual violence. And here, essentially, the idea is that men and boys are the forgotten survivors of wars in cases of sexual violence. Most often when we talk about sexual violence, it's reported in statistics that specifically talk about women and girls, but here, because of the issues listed to the right, such as lack of legal protection, reporting, lack of awareness, and ultimately stigma and shame, men and boys who are survivors often don't get justice or cannot seek it out themselves because lacking mechanisms. There are some sociocultural factors that are constantly working against them, that are perpetually denying them justice. And only recently was sexual violence against men and boys in Sri Lanka even recognized as a human rights abuse.
So now we're going to move into our recommendations about how to address sexual violence throughout the globe. So first and foremost, we need policies and frameworks that start with a survivor-centered approach. We also need to establish infrastructure for the prosecution of perpetrators. And we also need to provide survivors with proper psychosocial support and specialized trauma care. In addition to the psychosocial support and specialized trauma care, we also need economic support to foster self-sufficiency, self-esteem, and resilience for the survivors of sexual violence.
So in conclusion, we just want to emphasize that sexual violence is not inevitable. It differs based on context, but there's no reason to believe that it must happen. The purpose of this research was to illuminate how the failure to learn lessons from these conflicts that we have outlined today have long-lasting impacts on survivors and that are truly, truly traumatizing. And in terms of future research, things we hope to consider include how definitions of sexual violence limit justice, resource limitation in terms of quantifying this problem. We also want to take into consideration the effects of stigmatization. We also want to delve deeper into the role of state-sanctioned violence. And finally, we also want to consider LGBTQ plus and non-binary survivors who also face stigmatization because of their identities. But with that, that is a wrap on our presentation. And here's a slide of our poster presentation. And thank you for your time.